Humanity has already been capable of inventing, throughout history, dark and brutal punishments to torment its enemies in the past, when punishments were more than mere penalties. They were true spectacles of cruelty. They used, and still use, executions that defy any notion of humanity, each practice with a purpose: to spread fear and ensure that no one dares challenge power. Methods used to terrify, control, punish, and sometimes even take revenge, which honestly seem right out of horror movies. These are the punishment methods you will see here today. The torture methods of the Middle Ages still draw attention today for being extremely cruel and out of the ordinary. During the Spanish Inquisition, one of the most brutal was called the Judas cradle. This device was used to punish opponents deemed heretics or criminals, and its operation was so perverse that it caused a slow, painful, and humiliating death. Also known as the Judas chair, this method had a distant resemblance to impalement, but worked in an even more agonizing way. The person was placed on a chair suspended by ropes, which had a seat with a hole in the middle. That hole led to a wooden tip shaped like a pyramid. The condemned individual was positioned so that this tip entered their anal or vaginal orifice, and with the weight of their own body, the wood would gradually perforate and open the area. To increase the pain, weights were sometimes tied to the victim's legs, speeding up the process. The goal was to inflict severe internal wounds that led to fatal hemorrhages. And because the device was almost never cleaned, horrible infections only intensified the suffering, possibly lasting for days until the body could no longer endure. Beyond the physical agony, there was also the utter humiliation. The person remained tied with ropes to ensure they could not escape or lessen the pressure. This method, created by the Italian Ippolito Marsili, was used to terrorize anyone who went against the church or the rules of the time. Since ancient times, humanity has come up with brutal methods of punishment to control, intimidate, and of course cause pain. Often the idea is not just to eliminate the guilty person, but to do it in such a cruel manner that it serves as an example to others. One of the most frightening methods that still occurs today is the so-called fire necklace. This grim technique consists of tires filled with fuel, placed around the victim's neck, which are then set on fire. The result is a slow and painful death, with the body consumed by the flames. Unfortunately, this practice is still used by criminal factions as a form of punishment or vengeance. A recent case took place in the community of Cajueiro in the Madureira neighborhood, located in the north zone of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. A 48-year-old woman was found in a desperate situation, tied up, blindfolded, her mouth covered with adhesive tape, and surrounded by tires ready to be set ablaze. She had signs of assault, and according to the police officers who saved her, she was moments away from being executed by the so-called drug trade tribunal. It all happened because she was accused of owing money to criminals. But after being rescued, the woman said she believed she had been mistaken for someone else. The rescue was only possible thanks to an anonymous tip. The fire necklace is not merely an act of violence, but a message of power and control, used to spread fear and maintain order through terror. One of the most terrifying and painful punishments is live burial, a form of psychological and physical torture that is still carried out today in a brutal way. A recent case that shocked everyone took place in the municipality of Visconde do Rio Branco, in the Zona da Mata region of Minas Gerais in Brazil, where a 36-year-old woman was buried alive in a cemetery. She was buried as a punishment for not handing over weapons and drugs she was allegedly holding for two men. They demanded that she return them, but she claimed the items had been lost, which enraged the criminals. The woman was discovered by gravediggers who arrived at the cemetery to work and heard cries for help coming from inside a tomb. When they broke it open, they found her injured, with cuts on her head and body, but still alive. She had been buried with her head exposed above ground, prolonging her suffering. She had been assaulted before being buried, after the criminals found out that the weapons and drugs had been lost. Their revenge was to bury her alive as an extreme form of punishment. The two suspects in the crime were arrested, while a third fled. This case makes it clear how criminals use extreme violence to instill fear and carry out revenge, especially in situations involving drug and arms trafficking. One of the most frightening and cruel methods of torture that has been used over the years is waterboarding, which simulates drowning. The idea is straightforward, but the psychological and physical impact is devastating. When someone is subjected to this technique, the prisoner is placed in a position where the head is tilted downward, or the feet are kept higher than the head. Then a cloth is placed over the victim's face, completely covering the mouth and nose, or sometimes plastic film is used. That is when the torture begins. Water is poured over the person, who starts choking as the water enters their lungs, making them them feel like they truly are drowning. This process triggers an intense sense of panic as the body convulses, struggling to breathe without success. And the worst part is that although the drowning is never literal, the sensation is so overpowering that the person believes they are about to die at any moment. This creates a level of stress and fear that can last for hours. The technique can cause serious health damage, such as brain injuries, broken bones, and a range of psychological issues that remain with the victim forever. This type of torture was systematically used by CIA interrogators at secret locations known as black sites. These detention centers were notorious for holding terrorism suspects, where torture methods like waterboarding were routinely practiced. Crucifixion was one of the punishments most widely used by the Romans, regarded as the most brutal of all. Cicero, who was a philosopher and politician, called crucifixion the most cruel and terrible punishment a person could endure. He believed that even the word cross should be kept away from the mind and eyes of Romans, given how cruel it was. Indeed, this type of execution not only killed the individual, but also served as a horrifying public spectacle, meant to frighten everyone who witnessed it. Prisoners were impaled in a manner very similar to crucifixion. The goal was always to inflict immense suffering while also showing who was in control. The Persians also used this practice, and later the Romans refined it even further. For the Romans, crucifixion was a punishment involving extreme physical torment. The condemned person had to carry the horizontal beam of the cross to the execution site, where they would then be either nailed or tied to it. The suffering worsened because, in order to breathe, the victim had to push up on their feet, increasing both pain and the likelihood of asphyxiation. Many condemned individuals died after hours or even days of agony, their bodies succumbing to wounds or infections, though most died by asphyxiation. This punishment was reserved for the empire's worst enemies, such as traitors or prisoners of war, and rarely applied to Roman citizens. Crucifixion ended in the 4th century under Emperor Constantine, but it was still used in other parts of the world, such as in Japan, where Christian missionaries were crucified in the 16th century. Even over time, the cross, which for many carries a sense of sacrifice, still bears the weight of this brutal history. This type of execution rose to prominence during La Violencia, a period of civil war in Colombia from 1948 to 1958. It was a decade marked by bloody conflict among political groups and rival factions, and the Colombian necktie became a symbol of psychological terror.
Colombian neckties. I cut their throats, and then I pull their live tongues through the slits!
The goal was not only to kill, but to send a clear message of intimidation. Anyone who came across the bodies knew it was a warning to others. Do not defy or betray. This method began to appear shortly after the assassination of Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, an important Colombian political leader. His death sparked La Violencia, and during that civil war, the Colombian necktie was used on enemies and traitors. It was not simply about eliminating opponents, but about spreading fear through brutality. The bodies were left in plain sight, traumatizing anyone who saw them. Even though this practice was most common in Colombia during that historical period, it also became known in other parts of Latin America. To this day, the term Colombian necktie is remembered as one of the most brutal execution methods ever recorded. One of the oldest punishments is dismemberment, which essentially involved tearing off a person's arms, legs, and even their head. This type of execution was widely used as a way to instill fear and ensure that no one dared to challenge whoever was in power. The so-called horse-drawn dismemberment was one of the most well-known variations. In this method, the victim's limbs were tied to horses that ran in opposite directions, literally ripping the body apart. This type of torture was common in England until 1814, and was also the preferred technique of Attila the Hun to dispose of his enemies. Historical cases illustrate how this method was used to shock and intimidate. In Peru, Tupac Amaru II, leader of a rebellion in 1781, was sentenced to be dismembered. His arms and legs were tied to horses, but they did not detach as intended, so he was eventually beheaded. Afterward, his body parts were scattered across various regions to send a message to the populace. In Brazil, Tiradentes suffered a similar fate. In 1792, he was hanged, quartered, and had his head displayed in Rio de Janeiro, while the other parts were sent to different cities. In England, William Wallace, the famous Scottish hero, also went through a cruel execution. He was hanged until he was nearly unconscious. Then he was disemboweled, beheaded, and finally his body was divided into parts that were exhibited around the country as a warning to other traitors. And it does not stop there. Dismemberment was also often used as a form of public punishment, and these methods highlight how, in the past, fear was imposed through brutality. Even as time passed, it is shocking how human cruelty appears to know no limits. The heretics fork was an extremely frightening torture instrument, used primarily during the Middle Ages, an era known for its severity and religious intolerance. Far from being a simple kitchen utensil, this artifact was a metal piece with sharp ends on both sides, designed to provoke pain and keep the victim immobile. The main targets of these punishments were often women accused of heresy, witchcraft, or other so-called transgressions against the religious and social standards of the time. Using the heretic's fork involved fixing the device between the sternum and the victim's throat, secured by a collar that could be made of leather or metal. Furthermore, the person's hands were tied behind their back, making any attempt at defense or movement impossible. This position left the victim in a constant state of alert, since the slightest motion, whether trying to speak, move the head, or even breathe more deeply, forced the sharp ends to pierce the skin, causing painful cuts and the risk of more serious wounds. The cruelty of the heretic's fork went far beyond simple physical suffering. Its main effect was psychological, keeping the victim in constant tension, with no chance of rest, speech, or expressing any discomfort, no matter how slight. Thus, the instrument became a powerful symbol of domination and control, reinforcing the atmosphere of fear and insecurity that characterized interrogations and trials of the era. This type of torture showed the brutality and lack of rights for those accused, contributing to the somber, terrifying image of the Middle Ages regarding justice and religion. The Spanish donkey was one of the most cruel torture instruments used in medieval antiquity, designed to inflict excruciating pain and public humiliation. It consisted of a wooden bench with a central edge resembling an inverted pyramid. The victim was forced to sit on that sharp point, with all their body weight pressing directly on the genital area, causing extreme physical torment. To make the situation even more unbearable, the person's hands and feet were tightly bound, removing any possibility of movement or relief. In many cases, the executioners increased the severity of the torture by tying weights to the victim's ankles, intensifying the pressure on the instrument's edge and worsening the pain in a brutal way. The ordeal could last for many hours, or in more extreme situations, for entire days. Apart from the indescribable physical pain, there was also a psychological and social element involved. The victims were often displayed in public, turning their punishment into a spectacle of terror that served to intimidate and control the population. The goal was not just to punish, but also to demonstrate the authorities' relentless power over the bodies and lives of its subjects. Subscribe to the channel for more videos like this.